We have the Historic Preservation Commission of Vero Beach, Florida. Welcome, everyone. We can start by approving our minutes of the meeting from last month, from November 8th. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Against
Aye.
minutes? All right, we're good for that. Last month looks good. I have one tiny change in today's agenda, and I would like to move item B in the new business section to section 4, old business, since we mentioned it at our last meeting. And then that will also allow us to devote all of the new business section to our guests and to Mr. Jeffrey's presentation today. So we are going to move right on to new business. We're happy to have our new planning director, Mr. Jason Jeffries, with us today. Mr. Jeffries offered to chat with historic homeowners about local historic designation of their homes and help guide them through the process.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Jason Jeffries with the Planning and Development Department. I have a presentation. Unfortunately, I guess the video TVs are not working, so I can't do the PowerPoint up there. So if anyone in the audience wants a copy of the PowerPoint, it's there on the table. And then what I'll be doing, just going through, I'm sorry, I'll have to just follow with me. I've handed it all out to the members to go through the process. That second slide on the bottom, I'm on the first page. The second, so I'll just dive right in and just start describing to you the process. I'm going to start with the slide. It's on the bottom of this, the first page, which is the designation process. This just gives the overview of the process, which is the applicant makes application to, and this process is very specifically delineated in the city's code, what we're following here. So the first step is they make an application to the Planning and Development Department. Staff then reviews it for completeness, then does the analysis, and I'll go into detail about that analysis, about reviewing the property against the criteria in a particular chapter in the code. Once we deem the property to be, or once the report is complete, it then gets scheduled for a public hearing at this board, which is a quasi-judicial process. And I think that's why at the last meeting, your attorney was advising you that in this process, you have a certain role, which is to review these applications. So it's staff's job in the code to assist the applicants with the application and to review it. And then your role is to then hold the public hearing, make the findings that the designation meets the criteria in the code. And I'll go over that in detail, but essentially this is the process. So application review, public hearing in the Historic Preservation Board, you make your findings, you make the recommendation to the City Commission, then the City Commission holds a public hearing, and then they make their findings, and then if they so approve it, then it's locally designated on the local register. So essentially that's the process. I'm turning to the next page. The application itself, as I mentioned, the designation process is very specifically outlined in the city's code under Chapter 76, so this is the process I'm following. The application is to be submitted by the property owner to the planning department, so it's only the property owner that can make that submission to the planning department, no one else. It has to be the property owner. The process only allows, this is unique I think to Vero Beach, but only allows for what's called a single property designation. There are, I think you're familiar with the National Register, other communities I've worked in, we had districts. The code only deals with single property designation. The requirements are we have to have the property address, legal description, and a brief statement. That's what we're looking for from the applicant. And we have application forms up in our planning office for the applicant to complete. So it's our job as staff is to work with them to complete that application, get the application complete, and then we move on to the next process, which is the staff prepares the historic designation report. Now, the one good aspect of the process here it's different than the process I had in Daytona Beach, is that staff prepares the historic destination report. Believe it or not, in Daytona Beach, it was the duty of the applicant to provide all the information and do all the research for the property to be designated historic, or to determine the property's historic. That can be quite expensive, and I worked with a property up there that somebody wanted to designate their property historic. To hire a historic preservation consultant to do all that research. Here, that's staff. Staff does that. Staff does the review, prepares that historic designation report, which is outlined in the code that has a legal description, evaluation of the site's significant, the current conditions report, location maps, photographs, and then ultimately a planning director's recommendation. So now what I'm going to go over is I'm really going to delve into this evaluation of the site significance. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of these terms in historic preservation, but I just want to go over them with the designation criteria. So I've turned now to page 3. So the designation criteria is consistent with, there's several tests that are outlined in the code. First, it's got to be consistent with the criteria established by the National Register of Historic Places. So the criteria that we're using and to evaluate the properties is really based, even though they're local properties, we're using the criteria established by the background information that the federal government or the state historic preservation office has developed. There's resources online if you want to go look at their website, and I think I printed it. There's a really good page that goes through, and this is really what we would use. It's from the U.S. Department of Interior, and it's on there. So it's on the U.S. Department of Interior's website, and it tells you how to identify the type of significance of property, gives you kind of the overview. And that's, as staff, that's what we would be using in terms of determining the significance of a property. In the case of a property that you're trying to get designated here locally, it's got to be significant with Vero Beach history. So it doesn't have to just have national significance to be locally historic. It needs to be significant to Vero Beach's history. And then it's got to possess the integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, or association. And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. Then on the bottom, there are 5 basic criteria. And the property just needs to meet one of these. So either the property's got to be associated with a significant event, and this is very common in historic preservation, and I think this is where people get very confused with historic preservation, because a property, and I'll go through some examples, you'll see them in my PowerPoint. Historic preservation is not just the preservation of, let's say, old buildings or old beautiful buildings. You can be an ugly building and it be historic, and I got some examples in this PowerPoint, because it's association with a significant event, a significant person, the architectural significance, and that's what everyone thinks about. Obviously, this architectural significance, that's where we're talking about the beautiful architecture that you want to preserve under that one criteria. But it could be a building associated with a significant event, be an ugly building, or a significant person, be an ugly building. And depending on your view of architecture, if you don't like modernism, there could be and there's trends right now, and I'll go into a little more detail, but I worked in Houston before I was in Daytona Beach. Houston is known as a very modern city. It's known for its development after World War II, the explosive growth. They now are doing a lot of historic preservation there of all what they call the mid-century modern buildings, because of its association with the history of the community right after World War II and the significance of that history. So, and there is quite a trend throughout the country now of preserving the mid-century modern buildings. And then the 2 other criteria is archaeological significance or aesthetic significance. So just to give you some examples of these different criteria. So remember, you got those 5 different areas, you got to just meet one of them. And some buildings will meet 2 or 3. I've been involved. This criteria is this is criteria that's taken from the standards from the national government, from the U.S. Department of Interior, and all communities that have historic preservation have similar type criteria. So I'm familiar with this from my work in Daytona Beach, Youngstown, Ohio, where I worked, and where you just have to meet one of those criteria. Although I'll tell you, it's up to the community how they draft those criteria. I think it was in Daytona Beach. Here, you only have to meet one of those criteria. There, you have to meet 2 of them. They were making the threshold a little higher. So it's all in how they draft that legislation, as it gets adopted in the codes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through these specific areas, because this is basically the bulk of the analysis that staff we would be doing and what you would be looking at as a board. And what I have, you'll see there's pictures. I didn't want to really, because we would be reviewing properties in Vero Beach, I'm not using Vero Beach examples. I'm using examples, national examples, using examples of communities I'm familiar with that I know how they got on the National Register. So a significant event is a property associated with either a specific event, so it's a building so an example of that is a building where an important invention was developed, the light bulb, wherever Edison's laboratory, that's a historic site, right? Edison's laboratory. Now, I think his laboratory's there's a lot of those historic buildings have been moved to Greenfield Village in Michigan. Henry Ford kind of collected those up and put them in Greenfield Village. I think that's where his laboratory. So that's another whole interesting question, because the building itself is historic, but it's not in its original location. But anyways, so a building where a significant invention was developed, that's historic. You can have a local version of it. I'm originally from Cleveland. Supposedly, I think the traffic light was invented in Cleveland. So, whoever the gentleman who did that, his laboratory would be historic. So, we always think of the telephone, telephone, light bulbs, some of those big national events, but you can have some smaller ones that's, local, specific to a local area in terms of their development of industry. I was thinking, I didn't put any pictures, examples, but I don't know, computer-related stuff out in California now might be certain sites. I don't know, Bill Gates or whatever, or not Bill Gates, but what is it? The garage where Hewlett-Packard was started, or where I think Apple Computer started out of a garage too. So that house might be historic. And then properties associated with patterns events, so a railroad station. So obviously a lot of these towns, here with the development of the FEC Railroad, if the railroad stations still exist. I know in Daytona we had torn down ours, but
it exists.
Yeah, I know it exists. I don't want to talk too much about. Again, I want to give examples for other communities, but definitely with the FEC, different railroad stations, with Henry Flagler and the development of the FEC Railroad, those would be significant. And a building used by important location. If you look at the bottom, I give some examples of historic sites. Site of the Hindenburg crash would be historic. The World Trade Center. Now, this is interesting. This is going to be a common pattern. There's kind of this misconception in historic preservation that this 50 years. It's historic when it becomes 50 years. I don't know where that comes from. If you go read the stuff put out by the U.S. Department of Interior, I don't think 50 years is ever mentioned. But, I hear that everywhere. This 50-year trigger is what makes it historic. So that's And I have some other examples. When I got some historic preservation training up in Ohio, they would make a big point about it. You know, a historic event, once a historic event, it doesn't have to be 50 years, it becomes a historic immediately. So like the World Trade Center, that significant event in American history, it became almost immediately a historic site. And, you know, they've done work. I haven't been back up there to New York City since that all occurred, but, you know, they've done work to preserve. And the picture here is apparently they preserved the stairwell where a lot of the last survivors came out. So that's a historic site.
A question for you. It says property here, and that your view of the Hindenburg crash here is a place, basically, not a building. So it can be either or.
Yeah, it could just be a piece of land, yeah. Like that's the airfield where the crash. And that's an important point because if you look at the bullet point, couple of things to keep in mind with this significant event. It has to be a documented event or pattern event. So it has to be documented. This can't just be some, I don't know, I'm trying to think. Actually, I didn't like the national, some new cultural group got created and now it's it's got to be a documented significant event in history, or not only nationally, but even to the local history, especially. Remember, because it just has to be documented to, especially the way our code reads, to the local City of Vero Beach history. So it can't be speculative, and the property must have existed at the time of the event. So if the site is compromised too. Now I know a lot of times they go around and sometimes put markers on this happened here, this happened, but I don't think that necessarily makes that site historic. They're just kind of marking that event happened there. So in this case, this is just the property. I'm not so sure if those buildings you see in the background were there at the time of that event. The two, especially to the right, look a little more newer. The one to the left might have been at the time. On the following page, one of the things, obviously, when it comes to significant events, the most common event sites, and this goes back to your point, it's not necessarily a building, it could be just the site. Battlefields are historic. So I got Gettysburg, one of the more famous nationally. I don't think we have any battles, I don't know, unless something with the Seminole War happened here in Vero Beach. But again, I'm still learning all the specific history of Vero Beach. And that's the thing, as staff, I'm going to have to become familiar with the history, the trends, to make these judgments. Is a site significant to the history of City of Vero Beach? But throughout the country, throughout probably the eastern, throughout the country, there's different battles. But obviously with the Civil War, Revolutionary War, we have battle sites in other parts of the here on the East Coast, going north, that are significant sites. Now, more common where these are significant events associated with buildings. If you look at the bottom, here's some examples. And again, I want to give you kind of a local example. Again, history I'm familiar with. This is the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach. This is where NASCAR was founded. Now, this is a good thing to point out. This building is probably significant and is on the it is on the historic register. It's on the local register. It's on the national register, and it has association with. This actually meets criteria for 3. And I'll probably come back to this, but this gives you a good example. Just translate it. This is a local example how maybe here a local building might be designated historic. It's associated with a local historic event to Daytona Beach. I don't know if now up in Daytona Beach I think NASCAR's everything, but nationally NASCAR's not that big of a deal, so I hate to tell them that, but so that is really a significant event to Daytona, because of the significance of NASCAR to Daytona Beach. That's a significant events to the history of Daytona Beach, and it's in the bar on the top floor of that building is where supposedly Bill France Sr. on a napkin wrote down, and they met with some of the other race. We get all the history of the races, but there was a lot of the race car drivers at the time. They were independent. There were independent race promoters, and a lot of times they would promote these races, and the whoever would win the race wouldn't get paid, so they would take off with the money. And so, and I think that happened to Bill France, and so that led to this event on top of this hotel, which is to create the guidelines for car auto racing and the creation of NASCAR. And so that happened at that hotel. What I was saying, this particular building is significant for beyond just that's the significant event. The architecture, this is one of the few examples of streamlined modern architecture in Central Florida. I know I'm a little further south here, so I know as we get further south, it's a more common architecture, although I don't think I see much of that here in Vero. But I know if you went to Miami Beach, you're going like, yeah, we got this everywhere, so, right? So,
yeah, it's an Art Deco.
The what?
Art Deco.
No, this is actually streamlined modern. This is...
Stand corrected.
It's very unique architecture. It's streamlined modern is the, I'm sorry, because I wrote the staff report for Daytona Beach. The first example of it in Daytona Beach is a little of the history was, it's called streamlined modern, and there are little nuanced differences. And the first one was, of course, is the Greyhound bus station. Greyhound, and the architect who did all the Greyhound bus stations is the one that created that architectural style. And in Daytona Beach, I don't have, well, it hasn't been restored yet, so if I gave you a picture of it, it would not look that good. I could give you the color renditions of what they're supposed to be doing. But that's the first one in Daytona Beach, and that was designed by the architect who created that architecture style, because it's the gentleman who was the architect, I can't remember his name, with the Greyhound, who designed those Greyhound bus stations throughout the nation. And matter of fact, we didn't have good documentation. We just assumed that, well, if it's Greyhound bus station, it must have been designed by that architect. And then what happened, what's interesting, then the third reason this is significant to Daytona Beach history is the architect who designed this particular one was a local architect who's significant in Lucie County history. And he was a great mimic of architectural style. So you had the Greyhound bus station in Daytona Beach. It was designed by the national architect who designed it. And then a local architect named Francis Walton took it, mimicked it, and designed the Streamline Hotel. And he was very good at mimicking other people's work. Some people don't pull it off so well, and that's where you get, there's examples of buildings that don't quite, they kind of look like the style, but they don't exhibit all the features of it. But Francis his architecture in Volusia County, the buildings he designed are considered significant because he had a long career in Volusia County. He designed a lot of significant buildings and did them in all varying styles. And usually he always pulled it off with all the details that are, the materials. And that goes back to one of those earlier slides where it talks about the integrity of location, design, setting, materials. So his work always had all the design, the materials, those particular styles. So that's just, I'm sorry if I dwell too much, but that gives you a good example of a local house, a building locally can be designated. And that type of stuff we'll be looking at here, local buildings, or buildings here, how they exhibit in their relationship with City of Vero Beach history. And then I got a couple other buildings, Ford's Theater, obviously, that's the shooting, that's assassination of Abraham Lincoln. What's unique, that building, even in itself, regardless of that incident in American history, it was probably the architecture style, if it still was standing, hadn't been demolished, put aside the assassination on Abraham Lincoln has been preserved as that site now, but the architecture itself, I would say, is significant to the patterns of history of Washington, D.C. And then, and I believe some of the history of that building, the gentleman who built the building into the early theater was famous in himself too. So buildings can, again, just going back to that point, there can be multiple reasons why a building can be listed on the National Register. And then the Ford Highland factory, that's another example of that's associated with the invention of that's where Henry Ford did his first assembly line. So that's associated with the assembly line. And then the architecture, again, because of association with the architect who designed that particular building, and then just the architectural style of that kind of that early 20th century factory style that you see. Probably don't see it much down here, but if you go throughout the Midwest, you'll see it kind of looks like exhibiting some of like the Chicago style, what's called the Chicago style of architecture. Now here's an issue. I was trying to come up, so I gave you a whole bunch of example buildings that are significant with an event, but they also are, they're architecturally beautiful. Here's a building I think hopefully everyone would agree it's ugly, but it's associated with a historic event, which is Riverfront Coliseum in Cincinnati. This is where one thing, I know if you're a sports fan, there's always some great play or something, right, that happened in some sports facility. I don't know if that necessarily makes a building or a sports stadium historic. In this particular case, there was the 1979 Who concert. I don't know if you remember the Who concert incident that occurred in the Coliseum. There was a concert up there. It was very common for these large concerts at the time to do what are called festival seating, and there was some kind of panic, and there were too many people. And I think they had locked the doors from the outside, and there was a panic in the building, and people they were just in panic leaving, and I don't know, like 19 people I think died in the panic. So it was a very significant incident in public facilities, and it led to the change in building fire codes for public buildings, and it led to how Cincinnati dealt with concerts. And they outlawed for a while what's called festival seating for concerts. Actually, now they allow it again, but with certain standards. But it's just, again, that significant event, and it had some national implications because it changed how cities deal with building codes in large, or fire codes in large buildings for like these large concerts. And this is during the period, I would say, the large concert, the idea of these big concerts was just starting too. So we're used to it now, but I don't, if you get back to the 60s, I don't think.
I recognize that stretch of highway as being one where I would be in the middle lane going, darn, it's going to take me 30 minutes to get over on the
other side of the river. Yeah.
That is a really bad area.
They've never designated this historic, but I was trying to think of a building that, like, what is an ugly building that could have a historic event? And I just want to make the point.
I mean, it's gone, isn't it?
No, it's there. It's called the U.S. Bank Arena. They've never torn it down.
They built a new one though for the bingo.
The Riverfront Stadium is gone, which was next door, and they rebuilt. And you can kind of see.
Oh, this is the Coliseum.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the Coliseum's still there. Cincinnati doesn't.
Stadium's gone.
Yes, the stadium's gone. Yeah. Which I don't know if any of this. The only stadium.
This is. Because I used to go to shows up there. I can't remember if it was the stadium or the Coliseum where we used to.
Probably both. I went to college in Cincinnati.
There.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And before they had large music concerts in. You're going to start seeing some Ohio examples because I'm originally from Ohio, and so I know some of the history. And I know before they started having these large music concerts in the Coliseum, of course it was probably fairly new at the time, they used to have the concerts, like even rock concerts would occur in what's called let's see if I can remember what it's called. It's north of downtown, and it's in a historic, I think it's called Music Hall, Cincinnati Music Hall, and it's a large auditorium. Was built in the late 19th century, and I know my parents would talk about going to concerts in that place.
I remember Bogarts.
All right, you two are going to have to get together sometime. All right, let's move on.
You move on. Okay.
Moving on.
I didn't mean to reminisce, but I just wanted to put this example of an ugly building that can be associated with a significant event. What I'll move on to, is there any other questions on, so just, the test there has got to be a documented significant event that occurred in that building. And the building, and when it comes to like the site still has to exist. You can't just, if it's been built over, or the building that, let's say some invention occurred, well, now that, let's say Edison's laboratory, it's been moved to Greenfield Village, but the site is still there in I want to say New Jersey, I think is where he was. Yeah, I can't remember. Wherever he was, where you go to that site, that building's not there anymore. So whatever building is on that site, it's not historic, because it's the actual building where he did the invention is in Greenfield Village in Michigan. So that's my only, point. Yeah, Greenfield. Yeah, it's a very cool historic, because you can one visit, you see all the a lot of historic buildings of American history. Let me move on to significant persons. So you have properties associated with significant persons. So it can be a home and important merchant, or labor leader locally. It doesn't have to be a national leader, but it could just have local importance. Studio of a significant artist. Business headquarters of an important industrialist. So down here you'll see some examples I've given. You got the Paul Revere House, President Lincoln's Cottage. Now this is important, and I'll get into this more detail. The person, it can't just be like the person slept there. Like George Washington slept here, so it's historic, or Abraham Lincoln. It's got to have some length of relation with the person, and when they were doing their important work. That's another key test too. Although they do say in the guidelines usually, because when it comes to like presidents, they usually, a lot of the presidents' birthplaces are designated historic, and I have the President Bush's, that way you got a house that's historic for two presidents, which I guess we only have probably 2 of those in the nation. You got, of course, the Adams and their homestead up in Massachusetts, and then you got the Bushes out in Midland. But with President Lincoln's Cottage, this was a summer home, so I guess before they had Camp David. This house is actually associated with several presidents in that period, starting with Buchanan and then through like Hayes and Arthur. I guess they would escape the heat of Washington, and they would be out in the outskirts in the summer at this location. But this has been put on the National Register and restored. I guess it was for a while on the endangered list. So the house is associated architecturally because it's let's see, I wrote this down, make sure I forget, Gothic Revival style. But it's only briefly used by President Lincoln, only in the summers during his presidency. But it's significant. It's a long enough time because during that time they believe that's where he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, drafted it, was at this location when he was out there, in the summers escaping Washington. So that building has been listed on the National Register, and has been restored. For a while it was on the endangered list. But it's just, I just want to make that point, is it's got to be associated when they were doing what made them famous, essentially. And then, but it's interesting, they use the term usually. So then you got just the house in Midland where President Bush Sr. had moved out there, moved his family to. This is where I think Jeb Bush was born. So it's associated with 2 presidents, a governor. But I put this in there really because you can have a house that's of, because like President Lincoln Cottage, it's significant architecturally. Here's a house I would say from an architectural standpoint, it's not very significant. It's only significant with the person. And then when it comes to presidents, they do, somebody very significant nationally, they do say they do list those on the National Register, even though that's not really during the time that for their historic significance. Because this is before he even got into politics. This is when he was Now what's interesting about this site, you go to Midland's history, this is during the time of the history of George Bush, but he was, he was in the oil industry. So he went out, he graduated college, went out to Midland. Could argue the house was significant for Midland's history because he had not yet moved to Houston, got into politics, but he had become a significant business person in the oil industry, which is an important industry, to Midland. So there's, that house had significance. Even if he had never become president, maybe had some significance because he was an early industrial leader in Midland, Texas. Maybe. They obviously qualified because of the presidential. So significant person, there's like 2-part test. One, you got to determine the importance of the individual. So it's got to have specific contributions to history. So that's what I was talking about, their contributions to that local, and it could be local history. It's not national history. I gave you some national examples, but it could be the local history. Significant in their respective profession or field, and then it's got to be all identified and documented. Here's a couple examples I give you from Daytona Beach. One is, this is called the Mayor Armstrong House. This is a house, it hasn't been listed there, but I could tell you, before I left, we were looking at it. Actually, I got this picture off the web. That's the person I was working with who wanted it to be designated in his neighborhood. Mayor Armstrong And again, this goes back to kind of the documented significance of the person. I don't know if just every mayor of a community would necessarily be historic. This particular mayor has a very, apologize offending any former mayor, but this particular mayor has some significant history to Daytona Beach, made a little notorious. He was kind of the boss of Daytona Beach in the 1930s when a lot of that federal money, think of the, the WPA projects was flowing, and there's a little notorious history to Daytona. Well, I know Daytona has a lot of notorious history, but this particular one, the state had to come in while this guy was mayor. So while he was mayor, a lot of projects were done, and he got a lot of money, but might have been paying off a few contractors too. And there was some corruption, and the state actually had to come in and basically, what did they do? They revoked the charter of the city at the time and basically established a new city charter. So actually, I know this is a big thing I always taught you when I first got there. We always had referred, it's not the city of Daytona, it's the city of Daytona Beach because it's the second city. So this guy was mayor, and I think he tried getting his wife to be put on when he was found, when he had, I think, had been disqualified because I don't know if he had been convicted, so he got his wife to be, some notorious history. So it's significant to the history of the community. He's quite a character in the history of Daytona Beach, and so his house, his association with him, and his association with Daytona Beach history would be locally significant. The Josie Rogers house, that actually is a designated historic site. The city's actually gotten grants for it from the state and federal government. That house is associated with two people. It's associated first, we call it the Josie Rogers house because she was the first female mayor of Daytona, and very early in the history, like in the 1920s or something. She was the first female mayor of Daytona Beach. And then her father, who is, I think it's D.D. Rogers, he platted a lot of it's even historic for his association with him and he built the house. And he was a surveyor and had platted a lot of the original town of Daytona. So his significance in the history of Daytona Beach. And then Josie Rogers, not only her for being the first female mayor to Daytona Beach, but she was also a local doctor. And so again, her association with the local historic field.
Quick question. What's the ownership on that property?
Well, okay. So the house is not actually located the house has been moved 3 times.
This is ringing a familiar chord here. What?
So the house has been moved into the city's park, into what's called river. It used to be across the street. I don't know if you're familiar. Like Daytona Beach is a little more linear to the what's called the Halifax River. So this house was located on what's called the east side or west side it was originally located on the west side of Beach Street, which is the main, this is a little odd thing about Daytona Beach. Beach Street is not on the beach side, it's on the mainland. So they're a little confused up there. So along the river, it's called Beach Street. And the house was on the west side. That was the property the family owned. The city bought the house to preserve it and relocated it into the park, which was on the east side of the Beach Street along the river. But it's still on the historic register, even though it's been relocated, because the house is preserved as it looked at her time when she was mayor.
So the home was donated by someone?
Oh no, the city had to buy it.
The city had to buy it?
Yeah, the city bought it. Oh well. They sold. Well, the city bought the property and then relocated the house into and the house was, they bought it. The house had been. It was not in good shape, so I mean, it was not valued very high. I can't remember. I think they bought the house for like $60,000. So, and then they got grants to restore it.
Well, that's what triggered the question. When you said that the city had applied for grants, I figured it was not something that was owned by a citizen in the community any longer, so that it was a city property.
It's a city property, yeah. And once the city there were restrictions placed on it by the granting agency. And the last example, that's Henry Ford's.
Would you like to add something,
I
Ruth?
have a question. I'm Ruth Stanbridge.
Ruth, you'll need to come up to the microphone.
Sure.
Well, I just had a real quick question on this item. My name is Ruth Stanbridge. I'm with the Indian River County Historical Society. My question was this house on the National Register before it was moved?
No, the city did all that as part of the move.
Okay, that's very unusual to have it moved like that.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Make a note,
To a
counselor.
site that is not connected with the house.
Well, it was across the street, so they had to, I think, I think a house can still be historic if it's relocated. Like I said, talked about those houses up in Greenfield Village. I think they're still historic,
sure,
even though they've been
sure.
moved
But usually-
thousands, around how many miles
The
from.
National Register goes with the site too, if possible.
But integrity, you gotta, and I'm, to be honest, I'm,
Got to move it the right way.
yeah. Well, and this house is restored, and it's being maintained as it looked at the
As a period home.
as a period, yeah. So, yeah, and I'd have to look, you're right, there are, I kind of mentioned, I'm not getting into too much detail, there are, you do have to look at what's called the integrity of the site.
Yeah.
But in the report designating this, they dealt, they're upfront with it's being moved, and the integrity was just the structure itself. And I want to say in the report, we dealt with the fact that really it was just located across the street, too, from it. So it's close to its original site. So,
Our Gifford house is like that.
Yeah, and
okay.
the Holly Shalhoub is actually watching the proceedings today. She's in Orlando, so there were
She wanted to ask that question.
lots of parallels here, except it's not owned by the city.
Hi, I'm Vicki Gould, and the woman Deborah's talking about did send me the question too, that the Gifford house, and the Giffords are very integral to our community back in the day.
Founding family, first
Yeah,
home.
and it was moved across the street, and she's wondering if it would be eligible to be designated.
It's on the same original homestead from the 1800s that,
When was it moved?
50s?
Okay.
50s.
It might be. I'd have to look at it.
Usually, I think what it is, if it's around the same area, it'll still be considered.
Yeah.
But if you were to move it to a completely different section of the city, it would lose its stuff.
Yeah.
The Giffords had 165 acres right there in their homestead, the first homestead in this area. And they just moved it.
Yeah, I'm not picking them up.
I think it should. I think
it will
still. Turn that on, please.
I'm trying to think. This particular house is Josie Rogers' house. I told you it's been moved 2 times. At least 2 times I know. They did the same thing. It was a homestead, kind of like it was a homestead property, kind of the north of downtown. What is now today, like in the center of the city, but if you go back to what was the original town of Daytona, that was kind of the north edge where they lived and was their homestead. And then as commercial development started occurring, I believe in the 20s or 30s, and they're on this Beach Street, and Beach Street was like as the commercial development started coming more up towards where their house was, they moved so they could sell their property. Their house was like right on Beach Street. Right over, across the street from the park, overlooking the river, and the family themselves, the Rogers family, moved the house further west and sold off the property in the front to build for commercial development. So the family themselves had already relocated it, and then the house was like subdivided into like apartments, like in the 60s and 70s. The family was doing this. They were the heirs were just renting it out, and then that's when it kind of fell into they weren't really maintaining the house, so that's why it ended up being and then local.
We know that transition well.
There's a common history of a lot of communities, and then somehow the city got involved, bought it as the significant site, and then because of some of our redevelopment and the way it was tucked into this neighborhood and what it was surrounded to. And that's probably was too, I'd have to go back to the report, but I think I think the city justified it when they did and again, I would tell you the staff didn't do the report. They would hire a consultant who did a report for them. So, and I think I've seen the firm, Historic Preservation Associates, I think I've seen some of the reports here that have been done. That same firm did a lot of the work up in Daytona Beach. Well, no, I think it's older work I've seen. I've gotten, Anna's has given me some stuff.
Dr. Adams out of...
Yeah, I've worked with a guy named...
Paul Weaver. Paul.
Yes, Paul.
Okay, this meeting is being recorded and televised, so we have got to speak into microphones.
Kira, would it be all right, before they made a comment, can we pass the mic if they just introduced themselves and made a comment?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay,
Just it needs to be in the microphone.
Everyone, let's do this. Then you won't have to march up here and turn around and march back, and we'll just do...
So I think because what had happened to the site around it, in fact, the city was moving it closer to the river, even though further east than originally was. It probably did. I think the city justified it to keep its historic designation because of the integrity that improved the integrity of the site. Because what was around it, what had developed around it, it had really lost that integrity. So I think that was some of their justification. And the fact that then they were going to restore it back to the period, as a period home. So, let's see, some other, so first there's the importance of the person, and then there's the second test is and I was talking about that a little before when I was talking about some of those homes associated with presidents. There's the length or nature of the association of the property. So the property must illustrate and not be commemorative, and I got some examples of those, associated with the person's productive life. So that's where I was talking about, it can't just be where they, President Washington slept here or President Lincoln slept here. It's got to be really associated with that, what made them historic. And then the house reflects the time period when they achieved the significance. So again, that goes back to the Rogers house. It's maintained, or the city restored it back to the time period that reflects that period of its significance. And then it's the person's home, business, office, or studio. And then you'll see this is where that provision, I say usually properties that pre or post date, and I put that usually. So that's where you see a lot of, I know presidential homes are always listed, and is significant, but it predates. Some examples I have here, and I think this is, again, kind of going back, we're talking about the Giffords or some of here's an example. This is my hometown where I grew up in Ohio, this Calhoun settler house. This is the settler home for the, for one of the original settlers I'm originally from the Cleveland area. Cleveland's known as the Western Reserve of Connecticut. So this is a settler home. It's not a very, I'd say any of the settler homes, those original settler homes in Bay Village, as it was at the frontier, they're on the National Register. They're historic sites. So that's their actual home that they constructed. The cabin, so when they first came out west, when it was the western frontier, what is now we call the Midwest, they lived in cabins. Well, that cabin is not historic because that's a replica. And that was built by the Boy Scouts in 1976 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the United States. So that cabin is not historic because it's just a replica of their cabin. I don't even know if it's an exact replica. They just did a commemorative cabin to commemorate that the original settlers came out there and lived in log cabins before they built their first milled structure homes, what you see in that Calhoun settler house. So this I use as an example. So just because you have a structure that's commemorative of the historic site, and I've seen some I think throughout Illinois and Kentucky with Lincoln, there's these log cabins that are, I saw a video one time on, there's several cabins throughout Kentucky and Illinois that claim to be, Lincoln's cabin that he lived in.
Place, and then one's another one where.
Yeah, and they've done tests on the wood. They were built probably in the late 1900s. They could tell by testing the wood. The wood does not date from the 1820s or where he would have been young. So those are not truly historic. And I don't even know if they're maybe been accidentally put on the historic register, and they really should not be. And of course, then I got an example. I wanted to get like an artist. That's Norman Rockwell's studio. That's where he painted a lot of his famous artwork up in New England. So that's an example of something associated with an artist in somebody's workplace. Is there any other questions? I'll move on to architectural significance. So property associated with design and construction. So these are houses or commercial buildings that represent significant style of architecture. It could be a movie theater embodying high artistic value or decorative features. It could be a bridge or dam. So, and I didn't put any pictures in here, but not just houses are architecturally significant. It could be a structure like a bridge or too. Of course, here's some very famous national examples: Falling Waters, about probably any house that still exists that's associated with Frank Lloyd Wright is going to be historic. Of course, the Biltmore House for its high artistic, the value of that home. And I put the Edsel Ford House because of contrast to, I had earlier the Henry Ford home. Henry Ford was very utilitarian. Edsel Ford was known for his design work, and his house was designed to embody the English country style. And so, his house, it's historic by associated with him, but more because of its architectural style that it exhibits in the Detroit area. The next slide, I have distinctive characteristic of type, period, method of construction. So it could be designed or fabricated in the past history. So I'm putting in, you see two pictures here of two houses I've shown before. The Calhoun Settler home, this is a good thing because as I delve into Vero Beach history, if there's anything unique about the architectural history of Vero Beach, there could be architectural styles that are unique to Vero Beach. I'm still coming, there could be, I don't know. But a lot of communities do have unique architectural styles that in themselves are not nationally known, but to their local, they're historic. And this is an example of what I'm familiar with where I grew up.
Sexton's. Waldo, yeah.
Okay. I'm familiar with is this Calhoun Settler home throughout Northeast Ohio was known as the Western Reserve, and the Western Reserve is kind of a mixture between the Western Reserve. That area of Ohio was originally the part of Connecticut, and it was originally settled by New Englanders going west, and they brought that New England style. But as they got into Ohio and they were building some of their first homes, the Federalists, if you're familiar from, if you go north here, go up into Savannah or in Charleston, the Federalist style, which was very popular just after the Revolutionary War, was a very distinct, as you're coming out of the colonial era where the homes are more simple and then get into the Federalist period where they're more ornate. Well, this was out in Ohio, this was the frontier. They didn't have as much money, or the cost of transporting all that distinctive art or millwork out to the west was expensive. So they would do as much as they can to have some of that style. But so the style, what's called this Western Reserve style, is like this mixture between some elements of the Federalist style, but still have a lot of the New England colonial look. And so it's very unique to Ohio. So I'm just using that as an example of just a unique style to an area. And there's not much of the Western Reserve style left in the city of Cleveland because we know it became a large industrial city, but the suburbs like Chagrin Falls, Hudson, Ohio, do a lot of work to preserve that style of architecture that's unique to that area in Ohio. So that is referenced. The Paul Revere House, again, that's a colonial home. Obviously association with a person, but on an architectural standpoint, there's not much of those colonial homes left. Salt box left in Boston, so that would be unique because, and I ran into a lot of this in Daytona Beach, where there was homes, let's say I designated a couple homes that were Queen Anne. There was very few examples of those, so they would be historic because of just the unique characteristic or unique what's left of that period in the community. So they were historic from that standpoint. Second, this is where a lot of, especially homes, or buildings get designated under architectural significance, is because they represent a work of master. So I already mentioned that Francis Walton and the Streamline Hotel, that's kind of a local example. So if we got a local architect here who is a well-known architect to Indian River County or to Vero Beach, his buildings or structures, if it's residential, commercial, would be considered architecturally significant. So in this case, this is Francis Walton up in Lucie County, did a lot of the significant institutional buildings, high schools, county administration buildings, and then his style kind of changed throughout time. And so I put in the Streamline Hotel, again there, and then like very end of his career, he did the City Hall, which he's in a postmodern architecture style. So you'll see how he just keeps changing his style. And then I put the Rock Hall of Fame. This is something that was drilled into me when I took historic preservation training up in Ohio, and I was doing it in the late 90s. And the Rock Hall opened up in, I think, the mid-90s. This whole concept of a building, it's not historic because it's 50 years old. It could be historic just from the day it was built. And they love to use this example because the Rock Hall of Fame exhibited the architectural style. It's associated with I.M. Pei, internationally known architect, and it's a very good example of his work. And it's in one of the few examples of it in Cleveland. So that they said from the day it opened up, it was historic. So that's what they would make as a point. And then architectural significance, I'm sorry, and then the last one, I think this is the last aspect, they could possess high artistic value. This is hard, and this especially when it comes to residential structures. If you got a residential structure that's not associated with a significant person, it's not associated with a significant event, and it's not even associated with a work of master, and it's just it's a beautiful home, but it's just ordinary. It might not on itself be historic. That's why most residential districts, residential structures are designated as districts, because they're the pattern of development and that historic significance. So to be a residential structure, and I don't even know if I have the best examples here, I was trying to, because you'd really have to look at it, and the details of the work in that architecture would have to just highly exemplify that architectural style to qualify under the significance. So I got a Victorian home there. I don't know if you can tell in the picture, but it looks to really, there's bad examples of Victorian, there's good examples, and so this to me it looks like one that could, you would argue, would embody the aspect of that architectural style. And there's a mid-century modern, which is coming a trend now, I think, in historic preservation, is to preserve these mid-century modern buildings, and there's a lot of bad mid-century architecture style, and there's good ones, especially done by sometimes a lot of times in college towns. Some local architect designed his mid-century modern building in the 50s or 60s. So, and then the craftsman style. There's a lot of little bungalow craftsman style that exhibit some of the style, but it's going to be probably the larger, craftsmen out in California where the style started. This is like a house out in California that would exhibit it. I didn't really put any pictures, but architecture, the last two, just to go brief, because I don't know how much there would be designation based on these archaeological significance. Obviously, those are archaeological sites. I've seen some of the stuff on what's called the Vero Man. So obviously, that's an example here locally. And then the last one is aesthetic significance. These are more like parks or gardens associated with a particular landscape design philosophies. Obviously, anything that's associated with, now this is associated with a person, but if it's a park designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who's the father of park design. Now I was trying to think, you can have local examples of a park because he had a lot of people that he like trained, and then they went out to local communities and did parks. So you can have a park that is designed in his philosophy and would exhibit and be associated with it. So it could be the local, not he or his son did it, but somebody who was trained by them, or they tried to claim up there, but we could never find the documents. This is a good example. Could not find the documented proof of it, that Riverfront Park in Daytona Beach was designed by a landscape architect who had been trained by Olmsted. But there, I searched all over in books and Googled this guy's name, could not find. So again, this is where you have to really document that this person had that connection to Olmsted, and then a lot of the features that were built that they were claiming had been kind of, it lost its, we talked about integrity. So this is where we're going through a park master plan. But another example I put in here, Oceanfront Park in Daytona Beach is designated on the National Register. I just have kind of the postcard. Now, this is a site that's designated, but probably has lost its integrity because some of those structures you see in the postcard, or if you go up there, this is, I don't know if you're familiar with, you go up to Daytona Beach, right on the beach, where the Hilton Hotel is, the new Ocean Center. So kind of, if you look at the picture to the left, there's now a big hotel called the Hilton Hotel, and it's there's a convention hotel there, but the park is still there, and it is a designated historic site. But some of those structures you see there in the center, like those little pavilions, they're not. They've kind of, so the park's probably lost some of its integrity. But the band shell that you see in the background is still there. So I know I went on a long time with the. But I just, as a board especially, that's the criteria you're going to need, to be familiar with. And when you look at the report, that's what we would, as the planning director, I would be reviewing the property based on these criteria. And obviously, when I'd be delving into, if we're going to say it's an architecturally significant building, I'd be digging in deeper into how the national criteria, how they justify, how a building for architectural significance is to be justified to meet their criteria. Because there's that association with local history, but you use the national criteria that has been set forth by the U.S. Interior. And to go quickly over this, I've delved a lot on the criteria, but once that report, once we do, staff would do all that research, document it, prepare a report. It would be presented to you in a public hearing. You would hold a public hearing. You would have the Historic Preservation Board review. You would review the application based on the criteria in Section 76.21. I don't know, when's the last, I understand there's, 2 properties designated in the city on the local register? That's what I've been told by staff.
Are you talking about private residences or total?
I'm sure there's some buildings on the national register, but I'm talking on the local register. My understanding there's 2.
Are you talking about homes or buildings total?
I think buildings total.
No, it's more than 2. Because the diesel plant, we have our buildings in town. We have at least a dozen. Yeah, I would say
on the national register.
Well, they're national. I'm talking local register.
But most of them are dual registered. So.
Well, I need to look in.
Well, I don't know. We've never been before the council or the board on our properties or the properties that we did. The diesel plant is one. Now, unless he came by himself, I think Michael may have come by himself. We put that on the National Register back in the 90s.
Yeah, but my understanding, that's not on the local register. That's my understanding. But I'll get the...
Chris Runge's house, I think, was the first residential home to be designated.
But it's not on the National Register.
Right, but he was talking about local, right? Yeah.
Gotcha.
Well, I'll tell you what, I got to do that research. We'll find out what is on the local register. Right. What is on the local register. Some staff, just in passing, kind of said there's only 2, but I'll double check that. Remember, there's the National Register, and I understand there's, if I were to go onto you can go on the National Register, you go to their website, and they'll list, and I'm sure there's many structures on the National Register. The question is, does it have local designation?
I think we did one on October 12th.
We have
there was the last one that we did
in the country club. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Scott's. Yeah.
Okay, so you've been through it. My own point is you've been...
No, today, really, we are hoping that you would help and address just the specifics of taking our property owners. Everyone here today and the people who are watching, there are some others that couldn't make it, just would like some clarity as to what the process is and the length of time involved. Because it sounds overwhelming, and it isn't. When you're actually doing it, it isn't, but
I think if somebody wants their house designated, I think their first step would be...
All of these people in attendance.
The first step would be to get in contact with planning staff, myself. I'll give out my business card, and to fill out the application. So really, from an applicant standpoint, it's fairly simple. It's actually simpler than what I was used to in Daytona Beach, because as I mentioned, Daytona Beach made the applicant do the do that analysis report.
Understand.
And of course, I think I had one person try to do it themselves, but you really got to hire. Unfortunately, you got to get the expert, that one firm we talked about. No, I'm not saying there's other firms, but that's one of the more.
That's encouraging. So that they won't have to do that. So if we take that off the table, what's the time frame?
That I don't have any, because staff needs the time. It takes some time then for staff to do the necessary research, and I would say it could be probably 30 days. I think there are some deadlines in the code, and it might say it's 25 days.
Okay.
We might have some process questions just from everyone sitting here. I'm sure we do, and we do as well. So maybe we could just start with those about.
Well, let me.
If you're in it.
We still got 2 pages.
Oh, all right.
Well, I just real brief.
Yeah, now you're actually okay. Continue.
Sorry. You have the board review. That is a quasi-judicial process. You have a certain hearing you would have to follow, and that's why I was bringing it up. It sounds like you've been through a designation. So
yes, we have. We're familiar with it. It's just more for the benefit of.
So as the board, there would be that quasi-judicial hearing and there's a notification process, and we work with the clerk's office on notification of the meeting and do the quasi-judicial hearing. As the board, the Historic Preservation Board, they would make their findings and provide findings and a recommendation to City Council. There would then be a following meeting at City Council where they hold another public hearing, which is quasi-judicial, review the application, and then based on the findings and recommendation from the Historic Preservation Board and the Planning Director, they make the final decision. And then if they make the decision to list it, then it's listed on the local register, which then my final slide is the effect of the listing. The reason the main difference between National Register and local designation, National Register, when you're on the National Register, there's no local zoning authority over protecting those structures. Because the local policing powers or local zoning regulations, that is the power of the local government. So those actual protections on demolition or getting a certificate of appropriateness for any change, that's all, you have to be locally designated for a structure to have those type of protections.
Quick question, because I have not seen one. When staff makes a report, is it a recommendation report or just a factual report?
No, I have to make a recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
The code says I have to make. That's also different than Daytona. Daytona didn't have to.
So that was going to be my question. So the National Register, just local, is going to supersede national. So you want the local?
Well, local gives you the protections,
right?
Because the national, this gets into constitutional law. I don't know. Kira can explain. So we have your city attorney for, but
just trying to flesh out the benefits, because it sounds like we have a lot more nationally designated versus locally, and what the practical benefits to go circle back and say, okay, well, this is nationally recognized.
Local protection, local designation gives you protections of the structure.
Local protection.
Because you're using the local government's authority to regulate what occurs on that site, and the national government can't, the federal government cannot do that. because local zoning control is held by the local government. I'm not saying National Register is good too, because what the National Register does, especially when it comes to commercial structures, and I think I mentioned this in the last meeting, there are benefits to tax credits.
Lots of incentives.
There's incentives, yes. So, but what the federal government holds is the kind of more the carrot, I guess you would say, which is if you designate your building, and a good example would be here locally, the diesel factory plant. When he redid that, now my understanding is he didn't. I don't know if I've been told the wrong info.
I don't think he utilized local ad valorem, but he did use his federal credit, which is more.
Oh, he did use the federal?
I think yes, and that's the more substantial one. I think isn't it 20% or?
Somebody had told me he didn't. That surprises me because that's definitely the reason.
Yeah,
I mean, when you're redoing a building, the first time I saw, I can identify that is a good reuse of a historic building and using historic tax credits and the benefits that the federal government under their tax credit program can provide to a project.
Have you been in?
Oh yeah, I've partaked in the beer.
Other questions?
No, that's a very good example of historic preservation. I would say it's a very good. And that Streamline Hotel I showed you up in Daytona. That's another one. I didn't, that one, if I had shown you that building for years was not a very nice hotel, and a local developer bought it to restore it to its original look and then make it into a boutique hotel. So, and he was on, if you want to watch it, you just Google for the what's it called, Hotel Impossible. They're one of those reality shows. He participated in that. So, but that's a good example of historic preservation and really the combination of putting the local control and the local zoning regulations on it, and then putting it on the National Register for the benefits of from the tax credit standpoint.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot.
I have a comment. Katharina Palavoda, Executive Director for Main Street Vero Beach. There are two really good reasons to do national and then at the local level. I know a lot of people, there's a misconception at the national level to where if something is designated, they don't want the government to have any control, but they want to use the tax credits. So that kind of gives them the ability to use the tax credits without, you could designate it and the next day you could tear it down and nobody could do anything because it's pretty much just a listing, but as a listing you do get the perks of the tax credits. But at the local level it's important because if you want that to be protected, like the government does have a little more say at the city level on what you can do with your building. So that's a good thing too, so it keeps it from being demolished, and the city does have say in what you can do with it. So I think they're both good on different levels, but protection wise I think the city level is what you really want if you really want to protect your historic buildings.
I had a question too. Our whole neighborhood, Osceola Park, was designated as on the National Register. Does that mean that you have to do something else with your own home? Even if it was a contributing structure, do you have to do something? I know the local, but do you still have to go an extra step to also have the national for your home?
Yeah.
You decided to do both.
Yeah, this is going to be the issue on that particular case. What's interesting right now is the code is by the city. I'm just going by this is the code. As it is, it can be changed, but this is the code. The city's code only allows for local designation.
Okay.
It does not provide for district designation.
Okay.
And then if somebody wants to have just their house designated, staff is going to have to review it based on that, not because it's on the National Register as a contributing structure to that district, but its own significance. And that's what I was saying when it comes to residential structure. I've always been trained when it comes to residential structure, it's very difficult for a residential structure to get on get on the local register individually. Just
What was that?
Wait, you're saying it's difficult for
a residential structure, because you got to meet the criteria. You got to be
To get on the national.
Oh, no. Well, even nationally, on it individually, because like you're talking about that district, that home, they are listed nationally as a district,
Right.
not individually.
No, that's a process.
So what I'm hearing is that it might behoove code to reflect locally, to have designated local districts in the way that the National Register
It
recognizes this district.
facilitates the next step.
We don't do the same, we don't mirror that process at the local level with districts.
Right.
And it could be
We are-
advantageous.
the code-
So Osceola Park could be Osceola Park as designated both nationally and locally.
Right.
But
Correct.
code doesn't currently allow us to do that.
Right, and that's a legislative change. That's a policy established.
You can have districts under our code.
My understanding, you got to amend I thought there's specific language.
Historic sites consistent with the criteria established by the National Register shall recommend for designation places, buildings, structures, landscape features, architectural sites, and other improvements as individual sites, districts, or archaeological zones.
But then there's somewhere later, it's something about the code, it says something specifically about the code has to be amended to allow districts. I read that, I can't remember, and I forgot to bring my code
Good that
book
we're
down
having
here.
this discussion.
And that's what I was told by staff, that to get this ordinance passed, they took out the district provision.
I seem to remember that.
Yeah.
I have another question. I have 2 historic homes, and we unified the title on the property, so they're 2 different styles, everything. Would I, because it's one property now, do I need to get both designated, or? Because they're totally different in style.
I've dealt with, you're really designating the
the actual house rather than the.
Right.
Okay.
Because I've had situations where, again, up in Daytona, where a property was designated as historic, but only like the primary house was the designated structure, because that was the contributing structure. Some of the accessory buildings were built later and they were not contributing. It was very clear in the report and the designation.
Each home has its own merit, though, and it isn't as if one was like a casita to the major house. They're different architectural styles and different periods. Wasn't one built after, but they're still dated.
Yes.
And
Still in the
original to
20s.
Yeah. So yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful. So no handicaps to Victoria's having both of those homes designated.
Well, we'd have to look at it. You have to look at it individually. Each, again, have to look at them.
Right.
The history. I'm still learning the history of Vero.
I'm Peggy Landers. I have a question. Will there be restrictions on what you can do? I mean, what would the codes change on the house if you did this?
Well, once you designate it, any type of exterior change would require a certificate of appropriateness. And then when you would come in for that exterior change, staff would evaluate. And I'm sorry, I didn't go through a presentation on how a certificate of appropriateness is done, but the staff would review it based on what you're proposing to do, and would it harm the integrity? That's the general test. Are you harming the integrity of the architecture of the building? So you could do exterior changes, you just have steps, and that's something, I have not looked at what the process here, because I know in Daytona Beach, we had what was called a minor COA and a major COA. A minor, if you're just doing some kind of minor improvement, it could be just staff approved. Staff would just do the COA. If it was a more major addition or, of course, demolition, that would have to come to the board. And I have not checked.
I have a question.
I'm sorry, I didn't look into that.
Okay, they
COA.
added
I dealt with the designation process for today.
See, I'm looking at, they added a door, and I want to take the door out and put the window back where it used to be.
Which was what used to be?
I want to put back what it
that would
was,
be-
not what it is.
That is very appropriate. Yes, if you can document that historical, let's say somebody had altered it at some point, and that was not historically keeping with the building, and you're putting it back, as long as you can document that that's what the original, like have an old picture of
It's
it.
an obvious irregularity. That a window goes there, what is that door?
I have pictures of the house.
Yeah. So yes, you can do that. So you're not freezing the house at the time of designation.
It's from when it was built.
Right. So there are I've dealt with homes and doing historic preservation where they are designated historic, but they've lost some, like we've talked about before, the integrity of the style because the alterations that maybe occur. Let's say their home's built in the 1920s, and in the 1950s and 60s they were very good at. They loved putting all that modern stuff on historic. There were a lot of bad alterations, and especially the 60s and 70s. Pick on a couple eras, but
This is Ms. Lander's house.
okay. So definitely the guidelines for historic preservation allow for restoring a building back to the original integrity of the architecture of the building.
Do I have to meet current code with that window?
Oh, yes, you would still have to deal with building code, yes.
Okay.
But now that's an interesting, this depends how good your building official is, which is not at the city, this is out at the county. There are provisions in the Florida Building Code for historic structures. And so,
Yes, and this is worth talking about because a lot of people are frightened by it. They think they have to bring the house up to current code.
It depends how your building official interprets the building code. To be honest,
You need to have a talk with them.
I might have to. We'll see how far I can get because it's difficult because the building official has certain authority under Florida state law to make their own interpretation.
Right.
But,
Right.
Right, okay, I thought you said why.
No, we can.
I'm sorry, I can't change the law. But, and in my tenure at Daytona Beach, I went through several building officials, and I had a building official there for a while he himself had been a contractor, worked on historic buildings, so he understood and was very
generous.
Well, he was lenient interpreting the code to allowing alterations that still met building code, but there are certain provisions in the building code that allow some discretion by the building official on kind of balance that preservation of the building and then meeting current codes. And it is a matter sometimes of the interpretation of the building. You get building officials that maybe have only dealt with new buildings and want everything strictly to new building standards. But like I said, I had this building official who in his own past had been a contractor working on a historic building, so he understood how a building could be restored historically and still meet current fire safety codes.
Maybe so we can provide more reassurance to people. Maybe we should have that meeting and take some compelling materials with us and just have a friendly chat.
Good. And I haven't met the building official, but that's on my list.
As the county historian, I've dealt with them a lot, and they understand that we have these historic properties all over the county, and they will work with you 100% on
Oh,
those.
wonderful.
So that's good.
I have a quick question before we adjourn. So I understand for residents, a local designation would protect you from demolition, and for commercial buildings, you get like the brewery gets the tax incentive. Mm-hmm. Do residents get a similar tax incentive? Or is it just protection from demolition? Like what are the...
For a resident?
Right.
I'll have to research that and get back to you. I've only dealt with...
The tax credit is only for-profit making buildings.
Got it.
So
Okay,
commercial
Federal again? Federal or local?
Oh, I guess, is that just national or?
We have local ad valorem tax savings on the city portion of
For
your-
commercial only? Or residential?
I was talking
Oh, okay, that was what I was trying to clarify.
Yes, that's what I thought you were asking.
Well, there's also a federal tax credit, but that is only available for commercial.
Great, okay, so
They're
I was
open
just
to the
trying to
public.
delineate national versus local, commercial versus residential, and where those benefits lie. And I think that the clearer we can be on that, the more incentivized people would, residents especially, right? So it sounds like the local designation would benefit a resident more than national, although possibly more
I agree
difficult.
that
Although possibly more difficult.
I agree that making it clear would help a lot of people, yeah.
I have a question.
The national one is more of a recognition. It's more of a status thing than it with a home.
I'm sorry,
if you qualify, the national is more of a recognition than anything else. And it's more of a status and recognition, prominence of the building.
And one of the reasons that you have so many of our buildings on the National Register that we did not have a local designation. So in order to protect and maybe have a big stick, we use the National Register and you would not have a diesel plant if we had not, the Historical Society had not come to the city in the 90s and stopped them from tearing it down brick by brick and selling the brick by brick. And once we did the National Register and just kept warning them on and on until this board was established, and Michael came along to buy it and put it in the restoration stage that he did, we would have not just had a pile of brick. So my question is, we have put a number of buildings not only in Indian River in the city, but throughout Indian River County on the National Register. Are our buildings in the city grandfathered in for a local, or do we have to go each building at a time to get a local designation?
What I need to do is have the research done to, I don't know if staff has, hopefully they have that list somewhere. We should be maintaining a list of what buildings are on the local register. So I'll get that list.
It's on our website.
But I'm talking about of the national registers that we have, can they be converted over? I mean, do we have to go through the whole process to get them on the local?
Because the property owner needs to make application.
Yeah, it doesn't, according to your presentation, it doesn't sound like anything just is automatically grandfathered in locally. Like there's not.
You have to go through,
It's a separate process.
Yeah, it's a separate process because you're applying the city's local zoning authority over that property. So you got to give the due process to the property owner and have that hearing, have those hearings and the notice before you put that type of restriction on the property.
Now you should have the survey that we did back in the 90s for the master site file in your files. And I know a lot of the individual homes was done on that survey, that early survey. So there's a file there for these folks that might want to move forward with the local designations. So you already have a file that gives a lot of professional information in it.
Yes, and that's the research. That a lot of that research is done previously could be relied, and that's what I did in Daytona Beach. I mean, a lot of times they had already done. Matter of fact, there could be there's what's called the site inventory list that the state maintains.
Yeah, this is the one.
And I could get in, if we don't have those files. Actually, I think now the state's done a pretty good job of putting that on their website.
Online,
so it's online and accessible. But we used to have to just call them up and have them dig through their files to find the site master file on a particular site if somebody had requested a certain designation.
And that's your basics for your national register. And our local historical society would be happy to work with anybody who would like to put them, so they won't have the expense of going out to a professional. We have several of us that are retired professional restoration people. And I have one more question of this board. Does this board recommend to the city on their the city-owned historical properties? Do you have any recommendation that goes for city properties that have historical significance that are put on the list to be sold or leased or whatever like that?
I actually talked to somebody about when everyone was trying to sell River House. I was like, does it need to be designated so that it can't be demolished or sold? And I kind of went down that rabbit hole for a little while.
And I was thinking mainly of...
I mean, in order to protect our assets, maybe that's what the board has to do.
The 35 acres that is the Dodgertown... to complete that complex. When I was commissioner 20 years ago, we bought Dodgertown and Holman Stadium, and the city at the time bought the 35 acres that had been the golf course that the black players played on. And so my question was, and that never came up during all this discussion these last few months, because it is very historically significant from a quality standpoint, and to have it gone and not protected in any way.
River House, are we talking about River House?
No, we're talking about Dodgertown.
Well,
We've
I
talked.
think just the umbrella conversation is if as a city we're interested in protecting our assets from being sold, should this board move forward in trying to identify which assets can be historically designated, I think is the...
I think we have
question.
articulated, especially this person, with regards to Dodgertown, the historic value at great length with this current commission. And they have demonstrated almost complete disregard. So what I want to remind everyone here is, although we are certainly doing something important and something constructive and something necessary, even if these places had a multitude of plaques and markers, and it only helps protect a place for so long. The people who make the decisions are still allowed to make decisions that may be unpopular for the public or elected officials. So we can't, I would love to go put my own arms around that place and make sure that it never disappears on us. And we are familiar with the value of that place. If they refuse to recognize it, and if they would prefer to implement other plans, all we can do is continue to articulate the necessity of maintaining and keeping those assets as long as we can, and hopefully prevail. But I don't think doing anything more than we're doing now is going to change the course of history, other than just being consistently advocating
just
for
to go back to the original
properties.
discussion, though, it seems like what I'm hearing is that local designation does give you these protections. It's one of the main reasons you
But they are not permanent.
And I'd like to know more about that. So one of the research items would be, can we further explain how permanent they are?
So I talked to Rob Slezak about River House specifically, just like the history. And it was what, built in the 70s? But I mean...
It was Sea Scout House.
And
and it was part of the original park that was designated along the river there.
Right. No, I think you have ground, I mean, and...
It's very awkward, for this board or any board to advocate people protecting their property when you don't protect your own property. And we found that the hard way.
I have to agree. Deb, I would love to see if there's any value in us moving through these processes, at least to stem the tide and trend that is developing.
It wouldn't hurt to start referring to River House as a historically valuable property. We have not done that. So you're right there. That was
any kind of formality we can move through in order to stem this degrading trend, I think is valuable. And I think personally, most of the people in this room are all on the same wavelength as far as what we want for the future of the city of Vero Beach and its assets. So if we need to go through, and do this, the formalities of the last 2 pages to the city council, even if they say no, we've done our due diligence in trying to designate these assets, and even if it's not permanent, we've done everything in our power as far as the power that this board has been given to make a demonstration that these are important. Because we know that showing up in numbers at City Hall isn't maybe enough.
We have a wonderful...
I mean, I don't like the world we're living in, but it is.
We have a wonderful history of that entire area, starting down at Veterans Memorial Island, all the way up through the old Sea Scout House, how it came to be, how it was acquired by the city, how they worked diligently. All of these city councils before us have worked from the 20s to make all that happen and put it all together for the citizens of the city and Indian River County. And we also have lots of old photographs that show the old marina and the 20s, lots of things that I think people don't know about. The research is, a lot of it has already been done. So
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, it would defer a developer from saying, wow, that's really low-hanging fruit. I want to develop the marina or the river house. These designations would at least impede them in some way from this kind of grab-all crazy train.
well, we will be more than happy to help you with anything that you need for those.
Yeah, I have a question about permanence. If we have our homes designated locally and then you sell them, does it go with the house, or does it then come off if the new owner doesn't want it designated? How does that work?
Don't know.
I think it continues, I think it carries unless there's some resistance on the part of the new purchaser, and then it comes down to are you still...
It falls through the land, so, when they're doing a title search, I mean, they should, through their title search, should know that their property's been designated historic. Is that your...
Yeah, some people are still so afraid that if they designate, they'll be told what they can and can't do. And so we've had discussions in our neighborhood about if you sell your house and the next person has that fear and doesn't want it or whatever, does it...
Yeah, and that's a common issue throughout the country. People have this hesitation to historic, and there's just those, some people have had bad experiences sometimes with, people trying to use the historic preservation to tell them what they can do with their house. There's been, unfortunately, it's happened. I was trying to look, that's why I'm sorry, I'm on my phone, I'm looking at the code through my phone.
There is a process for revocation, but it sounds like it's more if there is significant damage to the property that alters it so that it no longer looks like what it is. If is in violation of the provisions of the Historic Preservation Tax Exemption Covenant. So I would have to do additional research to see if a property owner can, wait a minute, hold on here. Exemption under Florida statute, any one of the conditions listed in subsection A above or the following conditions just provide justification for removal. So there is a process for removal from it. So
If the owner isn't in compliance or chooses to not comply.
correct.
Okay. Then I have a question about ad valorem taxes. Is that for when you refurbish or do something to your home?
Yes, there's an extensive process that is outlined in Chapter 76 that you basically need to do a pre-app meeting to talk about what it is. It has to be that portion of the value that is increased because of your renovations or repairs, and it has to be that external part. So any interior remodeling that may increase the value of your property would not necessarily be recovered. It's that historic part.
Okay, and last question is, did you say that in the planning department you would help with the history? Like if somebody is, I think that was another discussion we had in our neighborhood, is working people. We have a working class neighborhood, and finding the time to research the history of the homes.
Need to do, if they feel their house is historic, they just need to apply. The actual research is actually required to be done by staff.
I just wanted to...
It's a shame we can't put the form up here so that you can kind of dispel some of the...
Right, and I'm looking at the, I don't know, I'm trying to okay, it looks like when it comes to his certificate of appropriateness, so this might alleviate some of the concerns too. It looks like most certificate of appropriateness are staff approved. Is that your current? And then I see something called special certificate of appropriateness, so that's kind of, looks like they have the tiered level like I was used to in Daytona Beach. We called it minor COA and major, so a more extensive, what they call special certificate of appropriateness would come before the board, which is, yes, that's the more intensive, like demolition of a site, the moving of a site, that is reviewed by the board. So it looks like it's kind of the same process I did. So again, I know a lot the control of or puts a lot of restrictions on a home, the process, and again, this goes back to my experience in Daytona Beach, and I guess as planning director here, I would try to do, if a house was designated historic and they had to do a COA as part of the, it would be all reviewed as part of the permitting. It would be no more extensive than a permit process, anything they would be doing anyways on their property. Other than, we would just be checking to make sure they're not harming the exterior. And that's what we, in Daytona Beach, that's all we did. You know, if we had historic districts, somebody would file a building permit and it would just get routed up to the historic staff just to make sure if they're painting or if they're doing something exterior. It was just part of the normal process. It was not really anything, generally I would say, more extensive. Now, if you had somebody who wanted to do something that's harming the architectural significance of their building, they probably didn't like being told that's not appropriate, but we try to work with them to get the, you know, I would think if you own a historic building, you want to maintain it historic. It's historic appeal.
But I think there's a real concern, especially with homes at a certain price point, where if a homeowner wants to put a window in, that they have to appear here at a session flanked by architects and engineers and window manufacturers, and you know, no one's got time for that. Right. You know, it's got. So what? So yeah, my quick look. Can the landers come in and just say it would just be done? And my quick look is something like that would be done up at staff. And I'll look at more. You know, one of the things I'm doing is I'm just looking at the processes in the planning department. And I'll be talking to the planning. I haven't even met, you know, you guys have already seen me twice. The planning board hasn't seen me yet. But I'll be working with them on, you know, looking at the land development code. I know the city recently adopted, you know, I know it was quite a while to get it done, but the comp plan, and I know the next.
Tell us more.
Yeah, I know. But I'm very happy that was accomplished before I got here. So the next task, I understand, and the comp plan talks about this, is really for planning staff to be looking at the codes. There's and I'll be
form-based code. No.
Well, I don't know if we'll be going.
Yeah, no, I'm journeyman.
But I will, you know, so that's some of the work I'll be working with the planning board. And so, even if things need to be tweaked in the historic preservation ordinance to make, so like a certificate of appropriateness can be more efficient, you know, I'll look at that type stuff. So it isn't such a burdensome. And really, my perspective on historic preservation, the experience of, you know, in other cities I've worked, is you really, so it's not such a burden on the property owner. You want to keep, it's the more intensive changes to the property what comes before the board. If it's just an ordinary change, especially if they're doing something like the window, like you're talking about, they're just going to restore it back to this look. That should be staff approved, so they don't have to come, you know, in a meeting and have a notice requirement.
People think, you know, one of the first misconceptions you hear is they're going to tell me what color to paint my house. We don't. No one gets involved on that level. So you still enjoy the same freedoms. And I try to tell people who are reluctant and see this as inviting the government to get involved in how they live in their home, as having a free insurance agent that's helping you before you do something that may be detrimental to the value of your home and your home's positive impact on that entire region. So that, and you still have owner authority at the end of the day. You could choose to not live in a historic home and not refer to your home as historic, undo what you've already done. But once you start seeing the positive changes that occur with this as it becomes widespread, then everyone is like, you know, totally affectionate and gets behind it and is comfortable with it. It's an invisible thing, really. It's not like having to do your taxes every week.
Right. The other thing, I think a question came up about historic districts, and I can get this, I'm looking at the code, and section 76.25 specifically states it's for historic, subtitles historic districts. It says the designation historic district shall be by a specific ordinance amending this chapter. Now, I don't know if that was how that's been interpreted, but it sounds like it, so the whole designation process is set up for individual sites. The whole designation process I went through, which I think is in 76.24, and then the 76.25 says you have to amend the actual chapter, so it's like a legislative action to specifically add the district you're wanting to adopt into it.
I would say it's probably a mix of both quasi-judicial as well as legislative, because it is an ordinance, but since you're impacting specific properties, that brings in the quasi-judicial nature. So it would be almost like a zoning change for...
would be a text amendment.
Right, but it would be like a small scale or, individual parcel zoning change rather than like a large scale. So it's kind of a mix of legislative and quasi-judicial.
Right.
Well, and so many of us, including myself, all live in Osceola Park. That's interesting, because maybe this is as easy as, not easy, but.
I don't think. Sorry.
Yeah, not easy, but
I'm new, but what I'm hearing.
Maybe it's just Osceola Park is not only nationally designated, but locally designated, and we just need to look at the language and go down that route instead of individual homes locally designated.
No, I think like what Ms. Hans is saying is, this would be it'd be a legislative process. So, and then probably, what it adds a step in there, it would have to go to the planning board. That's probably the difference. So when I don't know if, because it's a legislative, you're doing a text amendment.
Right. Yeah, and again, the big thing is that you would need the buy-in of as many of your property owners in that area as you could get. Because you will have, if you don't have the buy-in, then, you'll have those opponents. So you need to, and I was just randomly Googling, what is the value of historic preservation? And came across a blog, and it's like, it does increase the value of your property. So, people need to be aware that doing the historic preservation actually increases the value of your property, not decreases.
Yeah, and I would.
There's a lot of
misnomers. I would agree with a lot of cities in their revitalization have used historic preservation as a tool to preserve the neighbor, especially to a historic district, and it does spark the protection of that neighborhood and the further investment, because then there's people who want to live in those historic neighborhoods. Now they know if they're investing in that neighborhood, it's protected. The person a couple doors down is not going to tear.
It has a stability.
Yes, I would. What Kara is reading off the blog, I would agree with, and it's in my experience in historic preservation. Historic district neighborhoods tend to be more stable within even a declining community.
Used as
not that we're a decline,
example, the city of Pittsburgh, the non-historic Pittsburgh neighborhoods saw an approximate value from 2001 to 2014, a 45% increase in value. The nine local historic districts increased in value from 65% up to 220%. So I think that shows that it definitely increases.
So my question is, what is the first step to getting your home?
An application.
Okay, and where do you get the application? Is it online?
From the planning department, and I believe it might be online, but I'm going to give out my card so you can email me. It's on the web. The applications are on the website? Okay. On the website.
All right.
All you got to do is complete it and then turn it into the planning staff.
Okay.
Now for the districts, I think you might have to do some work in your neighborhood to get the buy-in. And then
I live for door knocking.
And then on and another thing I was looking, let's see. Under 76.24 undesignated historic sites. So this goes to the National Register. It's making reference, essentially, again, that goes back to what I said, if you have a property that's on the National Register but it's not locally designated, they have to still fill out the application form, because it states here that they have to acknowledge the property owner has to statement whether they're willing to seek historic designation. So even if they're on the National Register, but they're not on the local, they still have to come in and take that action and file that application, essentially, to get designated locally.
Should we cross-reference which ones are only national and not local, and which ones are pertinent for us to?
It's on our website, on the city website.
Right, I mean, I guess I could individually do the homework and just identify which ones we should pursue and seek dual registration.
What I think Ruth's concern was that there are properties that are not listed, period, with one of them being River House.
That too. She's concerned
and
about
again,
both.
this board needs to be careful. You are not the ones that will go out there and look for the designation. It has to, because you're the
on city-owned property?
Even on city-owned property, because you're the board that is going to determine whether or not they're designated.
Right.
So you can make recommendations to the city council that they need to pursue this, but you yourselves cannot be the ones that are out there doing it, because it comes back
to the Historical Society.
Board.
Well, when it comes to city-owned property, the property owner which is the city, would have to make that request.
And if they
Which is
it's
not the board, but is probably city council themselves.
Yep.
Which then it would route right through the process back to them.
There's many benefits to being designated. Lots of grants out there. We just finished one on the Women's Club, which is on the National Register from a state level. And we have grants all the way on other properties in Indian River County. So it is a benefit for the city to have as many properties that they have that significance, and they are significant along that riverfront there. And they all have a little history of their own. So, but collectively, it's a wonderful asset for the city, and it should be recognized. And I think it is recognized from the people you had in these rooms. But from a historical standpoint, I think it also makes it much easier to persuade the people in the city to follow through with their historic designation if the city's doing it themselves. So I appreciate you listening to me on this. We've been doing this for many, many decades, too many to think about, throughout the county, and it has worked. I mean, Fellsmere is a fine example of how their historical significance of that community has risen above what they had when we first started. And I'm sure all of you know where Fellsmere is and what they're doing for their community and their city. So a lot of the things that was talked about of special architects, architectural design, historic districts and all are found in that little tiny city that's just west of us. So I encourage you to recommend to the City Council that they protect their resources.
I will continue to do so. Thank you, Ruth. Okay. Any other questions?
This isn't a question, but I just want to thank all of you. We've needed this for a long time. The Historical Society, as Ruth said, has been working decades on this. But on the local level in our old neighborhoods, it's just so important. And that's why we're here, and we have more people that are working that couldn't make it. But we just want to thank all of you for what you're doing. It's very important to the beauty of our city.
Thank you for participating. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for deciding to move to Vero Beach, above all. We really appreciate it.
It's a very nice community, so I love it.
Yes, all right. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time, soon. And your cards, did you say you had some for our?
Yeah.
And then maybe, and I don't think it's possible to fill those forms out online unless you have Adobe whatever or one of those. I think you have to download it and print it.
Yeah, you have to download it and print it.
Do we have paper copies of those forms?
We can get it for you.
Okay, we could. That might just eliminate one small step for everybody, so they could fill them out or call you, hit you with the questions.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
thank you from everyone here. Thank you. Okay, we can go, we're going to try to, I'm going to try to make this as streamlined as possible. Old business, we discussed ways of making designation a familiar process, ways of inviting interest. Banners are being used extensively throughout the downtown area and the Arts District. Those sites, the ones on the street, have been largely spoken for and are used by individuals and financed by specific groups and people. We have 3 banner options, as I understand it. We can do a large, bold, attention-getting, like the kind they toss off the top of a museum, to hang from the second floor of a blank wall on a building. I'm thinking of this one here. We have an ideal spot here on City Hall near the utilities section against the street, which would be very visible. This banner would measure 12 by 4. Our next choice would be a series of smaller 2 by 2.5 foot banners to be used in existing banner brackets and frames downtown along 14th Avenue. I said existing casually. Again, trying to utilize the other ones that are out there, it's impossible and they're expensive, and then you have to get someone to assemble them, and it's major headache and time consuming. So our Main Street manager has very generously offered to share that wonderful 14th Avenue space. So if we make that decision, she recommends using 8 of the ones that we would create to be interspersed with 8 of the Main Street ones, so it would have sort of a candy cane effect going down the street, if you would, which would be hard to miss. So I think that would be a good way of getting the message out. And then the next choice would be just to do one like the many that are hanging out there already. The third choice would be the 6 by 2 foot that have various arts messages and designs on them. And again, those are all very competitive and privately owned. We have an empty bracket, I noticed, at the end of all this, right out in front of City Hall. And when I talked with ABC Printing, Mark Holt, who's been very, very helpful, said that he also that this one would be available. I don't know if it would be available eternally, but it would be available for whatever period of time. He would see to having it hung up for us, bless his heart. So we could do one that in a way and shape and form would resemble everyone else's. So I guess the most helpful thing here would be to know how many of these things we could get. And certainly if it was a single banner or a single group, that would not be my first choice because I think it wouldn't be as attention-getting. I would go with the gigantic one off the top of the building. I like the idea of decorating the downtown, and the banner that I was going to recommend using is bright red and would look very seasonal. And I am thinking I may have left it in my vehicle because occasionally I do the wrong thing. So it's
it was in an email to us. This is black and white, but that was red.
Yes, bright red. There we go. So it would look like this, same format, but we would, thank you, we would use this color and this shape, but we would designate in bright gold letters on the top with a copy of our designation plaque, and then treasure our historic homes, and then have an outline of Florida vernacular architecture on the bottom instead of a castle parapet or whatever that is on there. So it would resemble this. So I think the bright red would be very eye-catching. Many of the others are white with a white background. I think it'd be hard to miss this.
So it will say treasure our historic homes. In the email I have a copy of here, it says our historic home treasures, which I don't like. I liked what you just said much better. Treasure our historic homes.
That is how.
And homes or sites? I mean, are we trying to
We're trying to encourage more people like our friends who are here today to
designations are individual. Yep.
Oh, individual. Okay, I was just trying to make that clear.
But not buildings. You're trying to do it to the residential.
homes, is that the?
Correct.
Okay.
Residential buildings, so we're inviting more people like all of you to participate in the process. You are the pioneers.
I think Main Street is a great idea.
That was a very generous offer. Thank you, Catherine.
I can do for historic preservation.
We're here for you, too.
Did you, the issue that I can see with the big, large banner is meeting our sign code requirements. Did you talk with the planning director about that, meeting the sign code requirements?
I exchanged several emails with him.
Okay, I was just making sure.
I think his main concern was that I was going to do something gigantic that would hang off of a post street side. I think if we were to hang the large one off the building, you know, soft fabric one.
Okay, it still would need to meet our sign code, so we might have to look into that more, now that you have an exact dimensions and if you have your location. If it's on the city property, we would have to get the permission of the city council to do that. Any expenditure would have to go through the city council anyways, so.
And that is true? What's the time frame on that?
I talked to Jason about, you know, us sharing the cost, but we would have to take a council for permission for the funds to be spent.
Will everyone's home crumble by the time we get permission?
Well, the next council meeting is January 15th.
Okay. All right, so today, would you like this commission to endorse a particular design or just doing the pennant flags in general, or what would suffice for today?
Do you have any estimated cost?
Supposedly, Mark was to send them to us by this morning before 9 o'clock. I did not receive anything, and I spoke with him last night. He's usually just so good at coming through, so I don't know. I can.
What you could do is decide on which version of banner you would like to do, and then do an uppermost cost that you would be willing to commit to. So, you know, no more than $1,000 or $500 or $250, and put it in the form of a motion and make it as a recommendation to the city council.
So to give you a ballpark figure for what these cost, I even went online and looked at them because there's a place that cranks these out overnight. And, you know, the large one should be under $150 if we were going to do the big blanket size one. The smaller ones are around between $20, $30. So we would need 8. Was it 8 you had offered us?
You said either from, I think the max.
Please speak into microphone.
I think we discussed 6 to 8, and then, because I think we have 24 banners out there. So if we were to, I think 8 is the max, and if we only need to fit 6, at least we could have 2 in case of weather or anything like that.
Well, we'll push for 8 if you can hang 8.
Yeah, we can push for 8.
Okay. Thank you.
So in the email you have here, it says little ones would run about $35 a piece. The large museum ones are about $125. So you're looking, if we did 8, it's $280, so under $300 for the smaller ones.
And it would be nice if we could, ideally, if I could get my wish here, I would want the one for the building and then the downtown ones, and I think it would be very hard for people to not, you know, notice it and to comment on it.
Sounds like rounding up to 500, you could get everything you want.
Yeah, I would think we could get it done for 500. So would that be an appropriate amount of money to request without?
It would be an appropriate money for you to recommend not exceeding.
Okay. All right, so would you care for a motion to actually do this?
You do need a motion. You do need a motion.
All right.
So I would suggest.
Do I?
You can make your motion.
Okay. I would like to make a motion that this commission request a sum of money not to exceed $500 to purchase designation banners. Do I have?
In several ways. So if you could just articulate the ones.
Is this? we have to actually cite
Yes.
the number, okay.
So that they know.
So this would be $500, not to exceed $500 for 8 banners, roughly 2 foot by 2.5 foot in size, to be used downtown, and 1 large banner to be used at City Hall.
I would second that motion.
Sorry, there was some. Where exactly are these banners you're proposing? Is there some question about
over your
sign
door.
code?
The small banners, there's no question.
Boy, that didn't take long. Busted already.
Well, now there's motion.
Well, the small banners.
I was always, when I'm seeing these, I think it was discussed at the last meeting, so I was under the impression like these were banners like on, I guess maybe I was thinking the wrong thing. Sorry, I was thinking Daytona. We put banners on all over the place on light poles and stuff.
Right. The smaller banners that she is talking about would be the light post type banners that are already
so there shouldn't be
around
there's
town.
not a sign code
It
issue
is the question about the larger banner to hang off the building that we would need to investigate, that we could proceed with that. You can go ahead and make your motion that you would like to proceed with this. That's why we not to an exceed amount, that if in the event that we are not able to do the big large banner, that
Sounds good.
Could they just do it subject to sign code compliance or something?
yeah, subject to sign code compliance, that would work.
Yeah, okay, that would give me comfort, because I did not look for it based on wall signs on buildings, so.
I admire your speed.
Follow that code.
I think we need a second. Oh, did you second?
I'll second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, I think it carries. 3 ayes. All right, so we've talked about our banners. That's great. We're moving on here. Don't need to sell our banners. Printed material. I posted the ad about the Hayes House on Facebook. Of course, that cost nothing. I made a few extra copies to distribute. I put some of them on homes. I took the liberty to take that also, since I was already at Office Depot. I made a couple of posters, and I took one to Lowe's. Lowe's was very receptive, put it on their community bulletin board. And it was the only thing there as people went in the door, so I thought that was nice. It would be nice, and again, I'm going to talk about money. It would be nice to have some sort of operational budget where we could purchase things like this and not have to spend 90 days going through the process.
Well, that isn't how it works. The boards and commissions don't have their own budgets. It's through departments. So during the budget process next year, starting when they start the budget process, the planning department or public works, depending on what it is, would have to incorporate that into their budget.
So at what point during the year would we submit an approximate amount of money that we would like to utilize for things like this?
The budget hearings are held in July. They start preparing the budget. Tammy, help me on this one.
February.
In February. So probably at your January meeting, you would need to start talking dollars and cents.
That request to planning.
Yeah, it sounds like
we do, right?
Yeah, it sounds like it would fall under my budget, and I'm just starting to work on just what the work program for my department will be. I mean, obviously we're just they've been kind of, ever since I guess Tim's left, they've been on kind of a autopilot, but there's some projects I know that have been kind of held off on, and those are the type of work programs. Some of this might be historic preservation. So as I'm developing that work plan, there obviously might be some budgets associated with that. So just give me a little time to...
No promises is what you're saying?
Well, let me some time to put this together and see how historic preservation and the promotion of historic preservation will fit into the budget. budget, and I'll keep you informed, and we could talk about it at your January meeting also.
Again, did we say how pleased we are that you're here?
And there will be.
You think he's going to give us a bigger allowance?
There will be a work. I know one of the things I'll be working on. I think I might have mentioned slightly was with the planning board. I'll be working on I know the comp plan requires for them to have a work plan, which a lot of that will kind of affects the staffing and what we're working on so I'll be in the planning department, so I'll be discussing with them in that January meeting. So for now, I think kind of Kira saying I have to live with the budget I have, so that I inherited. So
we feel your pain.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
But I'll work. I just want to make a point out. Definitely, I understand the issues, concerns, and so I'll be, as we work through. It's going to have to give me some time to come up to speed on all this, and then just kind of fit it into this process that I'm working on.
Sounds great.
Thank you. We did get cards, and
they got cards.
Yeah. All right. All right. He's the man. I think I'm going to. Well, one other thing I wanted to mention briefly was, and I brought you photographs. Met with you once briefly about a property on Royal Palm, and I want to bring that up today because I spoke with the owner on the telephone last night.
And I did take a look at that property, and I'm sorry, it was a couple weeks ago, and I think I didn't follow up with you, but have the property owner get in contact with me. Yeah, definitely, they feel it's historic. I know. I have not gotten the answer. That's why I have not gotten the answer, because there are some code compliance issues on the site, and there is a order to demolish, I think maybe by the county, and I can't.
That's what alarmed him.
Right.
He said, I don't know what to do because county has determined that this building needs to be demolished. I'm going to stop there. So in other cities, I know that it can be the procedure for, before county makes these decisions, before they even think about making these decisions official, they would refer to, if it's a historic structure, if it's a structure that's a certain age, because they can't make the historic determination, they would have to refer to the Preservation Commission. The Preservation Commission would look at the property and then make recommendations either to the property owner, certainly ask for time there, so that something could happen other than...
If this is the one that I'm thinking of, that property owner has had more than ample time to make corrective measures, and it is a true life safety matter of that property.
Is that Royal Palm and 12th?
There's one... So I don't know that...
by the church?
I'm not, if it's the one that I'm thinking of, I'm not, I may be incorrect, but if there is some of these, it's a true life safety matter that they need to come down. And regardless of the historic nature, especially if it's not even designated, then...
well, he wasn't even familiar, not acquainted with designation, none of the above.
Yeah.
But he recognized that it's one of the original Spanish Mission homes along that boulevard of Royal Palm Boulevard.
Spliced it into a duplex, right? And he's like spliced.
It was chopped up into apartments, but the building is still standing. There's a carriage house, casita type building in the back that apparently, according to him, is in great shape. But he would like to have it evaluated by a contractor and see if it could be saved. So
he owns the building?
He owns the building, yeah.
Well, that's his responsibility. So, I mean, he needs to get the contractor and have the evaluation and then meet the code, these buildings issues.
So how much time is involved here? I mean, He seems to not know. It's like he thinks any day he's going to drive by there and the building's going to be gone.
There has been an order done to, I'll have to go back and look at this, but if it's the property that I'm remembering correctly, I could be remembering incorrectly, the gentleman has had more than ample time to do all of this, to get a contractor to look at it, to make the repairs on his own. He has failed to do so. So the last step for the building department was to order the demolition. So at this point, he's out of time because he has been given more than ample time to do what he needed to do.
I know that he's in France a lot, so he's not here, so I don't know if that, maybe it hasn't come to his attention.
Tough life.
Well, yeah, I would say he should be able to hire. Sounds like he could afford a contractor.
C'est la vie.
Get the contractor and.
To his credit, he did tell me that he did have someone look at it a while ago, and they had given him, just out of sight numbers and said that, these were all contractors. You have to understand that we have very few people in Vero Beach that would look at a building like that and be on fire for it and go, oh God, first thing we're going to do is this to stabilize the building. You've got a sagging foundation. I know where we can go ahead and have these fabricated. They're not going to do that. They're going to look at it because they know how to start with a blank lot, or they know how to renovate
I know what you're talking
a
about.
house that was built in the 70s or 80s.
When it comes
this
to older,
mystifies them. They
right.
look at it and they see, think of the conversations we had with people about the diesel plant before it was restored. It was like that, it's got to come down. Everyone would tell me that. No one wants that. Look at it. Look at it today. So it just takes someone with the background and the know-how.
Yeah. So he needs,
we're not living in Alexandria. We don't have those kind of people here in great abundance. So I would like to give him the chance to get someone who's well-versed in dealing with older homes that are in poor condition.
Yeah.
And
he might have to try
one last sign. They indeed may tell him there's nothing we can do at this point.
He might need to have to find, and I'm trying to think, unfortunately, I don't know if I kept he might have to get a contractor that has experience with older structures. It might not be somebody here locally. It might be somebody from another. There's very few in Florida that, I know what you're talking about. You get your standard contractor, and I was dealing with some of the buildings in my previous town where they just get a good contractor who's good at doing buildings, but they would look at an old building to go,
Precisely.
But you get a contractor that specializes in restoration of older buildings, and they know how to do it, what needs to be done to bring it into compliance and do it efficiently. Not saying it's cheap, but they can at least, they know how to do it efficiently more than maybe somebody that's more familiar with modern buildings. So yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. If you want to put him in contact with me, I can see what I can do to assist him to get a contract, but he probably does need to, if it is the building, we're talking the same building, he sounds like he's had ample time to try, find that person, so.
Well, he hasn't found the right person.
Right, I understand
That's
that.
the case
But he's
here.
been given, from the code standpoint,
And this is the conversation I had with him last night, that he could find someone with a background that's familiar that, and indeed, again, they may tell him it's hopeless too. I don't know. I haven't been in the building, so.
Right.
All right, that was it. Thank you. Any members' matters that we haven't touched on?
None from me.
And staff matters? Want to tell us how happy you are to be here at Vero Beach? Anyone else? No? I think we're finished. It's time to leave and go enjoy the Christmas holidays. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.